The wind carried a sharp bite that morning, rolling off the high plains and cutting through the silence like a knife. Cole Weston pulled his worn duster tighter across his shoulders as his horse, a sturdy buckskin named Ranger, plodded steadily along the rutted trail toward town. The sound of hooves striking the frozen ground echoed faintly in the open emptiness, the only company Cole had besides the occasional cry of a crow circling above. Cole was a man who had learned to live with silence. Out on his ranch, miles away from any neighbor, he had grown accustomed to the quiet rhythm of the land, the creak of the windmill turning, the distant howl of coyotes at night, the steady pull of cattle grazing against the horizon. Solitude was no stranger to him. In fact, it had become a kind of companion. Yet there was a weight to it too, an invisible burden pressing against his chest, a reminder of years gone by and people long lost. The winter had been harsher than usual. Snow had piled against the fences, feed had run low, and the cold nights had crept into his bones. Cole had stretched his supplies as far as he could, rationing coffee, beans, and flour, but now the shelves in his cabin stood bare. If he didn't make the ride into town today, he'd be boiling fin broth from bones and chewing jerky until it turned to dust in his teeth. So he had saddled Ranger before dawn and set out across the frostbitten land, hoping to return before nightfall. As the town's rooftops finally came into view, Cole tugged the brim of his hat lower. He never much cared for being among people anymore. Town meant noise, chatter, eyes following him, whispers he pretended not to hear. Folks knew him as that lonely cowboy out west of the creek, and while most left him alone, there were always those who speculated about why he lived alone, why he never took a wife, what shadows he carried in his past. Cole had no use for their curiosity. He came for supplies, nothing more. Still, he noticed the difference in the air as he rode down the main street. The town wasn't bustling the way it usually did when the general store opened its doors. The blacksmith's hammer rang slower, the saloon had fewer men outside smoking, and the women carried baskets half empty instead of full. There was a tightness in people's faces, a kind of hunger not just of the stomach, but of the spirit. The failed harvest everyone had whispered about last autumn had clearly come to bear. Cole dismounted in front of the general store, tying Ranger to the post. His boots crunched on the frozen dirt as he stepped up the wooden boardwalk. He kept his head low, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes, hoping to go unnoticed. But as he reached for the door, a sound stopped him, soft at first, almost like the whimper of a dog. He turned his head. There, sitting on the edge of the steps, was a woman. She looked no older than her early 20s, though the hollowness of her cheeks made her appear older. What caught him most was her dress, a white gown, though tattered and soiled, clearly once meant for a wedding. The lace at the sleeves was frayed, the hem torn from walking in mud. Her hands clutched at her middle as though to quiet the growl of her stomach, and her lips trembled as she looked at each passerby with pleading eyes. "Please," she whispered to an older man carrying a loaf of bread. "Just a piece." The man avoided her gaze, clutching the bread tighter and quickening his steps. Another woman frowned, shook her head, and pulled her child closer, staring away as if the young bride carried some disease. Cole's brow furrowed under the brim of his hat. He didn't know the girl, didn't know her story, but he could see hunger written across her face as plain as day. Hunger, and something deeper, shame, despair, a desperation that cut through her dignity. Cole felt the urge to turn back to the store, to mind his own business. That was the way he'd lived for years, quiet, distant, untouched by the troubles of others. But as he watched her shrink against the wooden post, clutching her stomach as another person passed her by without so much as a glance, something twisted in him. A memory of another time, another set of eyes pleading for help he hadn't been able to give. He shook it off, but the feeling lingered. The lonely cowboy had ridden into town for nothing more than supplies. He hadn't expected to find a starving bride in a torn gown begging for bread. And though he didn't yet know it, his quiet, solitary life was about to be turned upside down. The general store door creaked open, and Cole Weston stepped inside, but his mind lingered outside with the girl in white. He had meant to ignore her, to let her troubles be her own the way folks always did in these towns. But the image of her thin fingers clutching her stomach clung to him like a burr on wool dot inside. The store smelled of dust, salt pork, and flour sacks. Shelves were half-stocked, evidence of the lean months after the harvest had failed. Cole nodded to the storekeeper, Mr. Harlan, a wiry man with a sharp nose who was quick to count coins and slow to offer charity. "Weston," he greeted with a cautious glance, as though speaking to a ghost. "Back for your usual?" Cole grunted. "Beans, flour, coffee. Some oats for the horse." Harlan scribbled the list, then leaned over the counter, his voice lowering. "You see her, didn't you? Out there in that ridiculous gown? A pitiful sight, but don't you get tangled up. Folks say she came from out east, married a drifter last month. He cleaned her folks out of every penny they had, then ran off the same night. Left her with nothing but the dress she was wearing. Now she's been hanging around town like a stray dog. Can't work, won't leave. Begging for bread like some common vagrant." Cole didn't answer. His jaw tightened, but he gave no opinion. He didn't like gossip, especially when it turned a living, breathing person into nothing but a story to sneer at. He paid for his supplies, packed them into his saddlebag, and stepped back into the street. The girl was still there, huddled against the wooden post, shivering in the cold. Her face was pale, framed by loose strands of hair that had once been neatly pinned. The dress, though dirty, clung to her like a ghost of a life she thought she'd have but never did. She glanced up when Cole passed, her eyes wide and desperate. "Please, sir," she whispered. Her voice cracked like dry wood snapping. "Just a crust." "Anything." Cole froze. He wasn't used to being addressed directly. Folks rarely looked him in the eye, let alone asked for his help. His instinct was to keep walking, to turn away and let her fade into the background like so many others did. But he didn't move. A boy no older than 12 came out of the store with a biscuit in his hand. The girl reached toward him, timid, like a frightened bird extending its wing. But before she could ask, the boy's mother yanked him back sharply. "Don't you touch her," she hissed, glaring at the bride. Shameless thing. The girl's hand dropped as though it had been burned. Something hot flared in Cole's chest. He didn't know this woman's story beyond what he'd overheard, but he knew what hunger looked like. He'd seen it in cattle left too long without feed, in men out on the trail when rations ran short. And he knew what it was to be abandoned. Though he never spoke of it, Cole stepped back up onto the boardwalk and pulled open the store door again. "Another loaf of bread," he said gruffly to Harlan. The storekeeper raised a brow. "You all ready?" "Bread," Cole repeated, his voice brooking no argument. A minute later, he walked out carrying a brown paper-wrapped loaf. The girl's eyes widened as he approached, fear flickering there, fear that he might mock her like the others had, or worse. But Cole simply crouched down and placed the bread in her lap. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped it, staring as though she didn't quite believe it was real. Then she tore off a small piece, stuffed it into her mouth, and let out a sound between a sob and a laugh. Tears streaked down her cheeks as she chewed, her body shaking from relief as much as hunger. "Thank you," she whispered hoarsely, clutching the loaf to her chest like it was gold. "Thank you, sir." Her words broke apart, swallowed by her sobs. Cole stood again, uncomfortable under the weight of her gratitude. People on the street had stopped to watch, whispering to one another. Some shook their heads, muttering that the cowboy had gone soft. Others looked on quietly, as though unsure what to make of the scene. The girl tried to rise to her feet. clutching the bread awkwardly with both hands. She wavered, weak from hunger, and nearly stumbled. Without thinking, Cole steadied her with a strong hand at her elbow. She looked up at him, then really looked, and he saw not just desperation in her eyes, but a fragile spark of hope, the kind that begged not to be extinguished again. "Name's Emma," she managed, voice trembling. "Emma Carter. I don't have anywhere to go." Cole's hand dropped back to his side, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. He hadn't planned on more than buying his supplies and returning to the ranch. But in that moment, with his starving bride clutching bread and whispering her name, he realized his day and perhaps his life was already veering down a road he hadn't chosen. For a long moment, Cole Weston just stood there on the boardwalk, his shadow stretching over the young bride. He could feel the weight of the townsfolk's eyes on him, curious, judgmental, waiting to see what he'd do next. It wasn't the first time people stared at him. He'd felt their whispers for years, the lonely rancher, the man who kept to himself, the cowboy too hard-bitten to ever belong anywhere. But never before had their eyes burned into him like this, not because of his solitude, but because of the girl at his side. Emma clutched the bread against her chest as though afraid someone might rip it away. Her tears still clung to her lashes, glistening in the weak light. She looked so fragile, yet there was a stubborn strength in the way she stood, wobbling but refusing to collapse. Cole saw it, though he doubted anyone else did. "Best let her be, Weston," someone muttered from the street. Cole didn't turn his head, but his ears caught every word. "She ain't your problem." "Ain't no man's problem anymore, not after what happened." Emma flinched at the comment, lowering her head. Shame rolled off her like smoke from a dying fire. Cole's jaw tightened. He wasn't a man of speeches, but there was a line he couldn't stomach watching be crossed. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a few coins, and pushed them back into the storekeeper's hand. "Give her more," he said simply. Mr. Harlan blinked, startled. "More? Cheese, dried meat." "And another loaf." The murmurs in the street grew louder. Some scoffed, some looked away uncomfortably. Emma lifted her gaze toward Cole, her lips parting in surprise. No one had stood for her like that since the night her world had crumbled. She wanted to speak, to thank him again, but her throat locked tight with emotion. Cole didn't wait for her gratitude. He turned back to the store, collected the food, and placed the small bundle in her arms. Then, without a word, he tipped his hat and started for his horse. But Emma followed, her skirts brushing against the dusty boardwalk. "Sir, please." "I?" She hesitated, clutching the bundle tighter. "I don't know where to go. My parents, they won't take me back. My husband," her voice faltered, bitter on the word. "He left me with nothing. I've slept in sheds, behind shops. Folks won't hire me, not dressed like this. They say I bring shame." Cole paused mid-step, his back to her. His hand rested on Ranger's reins, leather worn smooth by years of use. He wasn't used to someone's voice reaching him like that, pleading, trembling. A part of him wanted to say the words the others would, "Not my concern. Not my fight. You'll find your own way." That was the law of survival out here, everyone for themselves. But when he turned, he saw the way she stood against the cold, a bride without a groom, her gown tattered but her dignity somehow still clinging to her. Her eyes searched his face, looking not for pity but for a scrap of mercy, a chance. "I can work," she blurted, as though afraid he'd ride off before she said it. "I'll cook, clean, tend animals. I'm not afraid of hard work. Just don't leave me here." Cole studied her silently, his face carved in stone beneath the brim of his hat. The wind carried the faint sound of saloon music, of children playing somewhere down the street. Life went on around them, but in that moment, the world seemed to shrink until it was only him, her, and the question hanging between them. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low, gravelly from years of disuse. I've got a ranch out past the creek. It ain't much, and it's no place for a lady. But if you want food shelter, it's there." Emma's breath caught, her eyes widening. It wasn't a promise of rescue, not the fairy tale salvation of stories. It was plain, rough, and practical, exactly what she needed. She nodded quickly, clutching the bundle tighter. As though afraid he'd change his mind, Cole helped her mount Ranger, then swung into the saddle behind her. Gasps rippled through the watching crowd. Whispers followed, the lonely cowboy taking in the runaway bride. Some sneered, others shook their heads, but none dared stop him. As they rode out of town, the horizon stretched wide and endless before them. Emma held the food close, her back pressed cautiously against Cole's chest. For the first time since her abandonment, she felt the smallest flicker of safety. And for the first time in years, Cole felt something shift inside him, an unfamiliar stirring he couldn't yet name. The lonely cowboy had meant to buy supplies and ride home alone. Instead, he left town with a hungry bride at his side, unaware that the quiet world he'd built was about to be cracked open by the fragile but unyielding strength of the woman he had just chosen not to ignore. The sun was dipping low by the time Cole Weston and Emma reached the ranch. The ride had been quiet, the only sounds the steady thud of Ranger's hooves and the occasional whistle of the prairie wind. Emma hadn't spoken much after they left town, though her thoughts churned ceaselessly. She clutched the bundle of food against her chest, afraid to loosen her grip, as if letting go of it would send her spiraling back into hunger and humiliation. When they finally crested the ridge, Cole's ranch came into view. It was no grand estate, just a weathered log cabin with smoke curling from its chimney, a modest barn, a corral with a few horses, and open fields that stretched until they met the sky. To Emma, it looked rough and lonely. To Cole, it was home. He dismounted first, then offered her a steady hand down. She hesitated before taking it, unused to the roughness of his palm, but she allowed him to guide her to the ground. Cole untied his saddlebags and slung them over one shoulder. "This way," he said simply. Pushing open the cabin door. Inside, the room smelled faintly of wood smoke and leather. A single table stood near the hearth, a bed against the far wall, shelves lined with jars and worn tools. It wasn't much, but it was clean. Cole set the supplies down and lit a lantern, casting a warm glow across the space. Emma's eyes roamed the cabin plain, utilitarian but safe. Safer than a back alley or the cold dirt floor of an empty barn. "You'll sleep there," Cole said, nodding to the bed. "I'll take the floor by the fire." Emma's lips parted. No one had offered her a place to sleep in weeks. I don't mean to trouble you." "You're no trouble," he interrupted, though his tone was more matter-of-fact than gentle. "You're hungry. Eat." Her hands trembled as she unwrapped the bread and cheese. She ate slowly at first, careful not to appear desperate, but hunger soon overcame caution, and she devoured the food with quiet intensity. Cole sat across from her at the table, sipping coffee from a tin mug, his eyes steady but unreadable. He didn't comment on her appetite, nor did he scold her when she nearly ate more than half the loaf. Instead, when she finally leaned back with a sigh, he rose and set another log on the fire. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackle of flames. Emma felt the need to fill it, to explain herself. "I wasn't always like this," she said softly, staring at the breadcrumbs on the table. "I was supposed to start a new life. My husband—" She stopped, swallowing hard. The word still burned like a coal in her throat. "He promised me everything. The night of the wedding, he took all my father's money and disappeared. Left me in a strange town with nothing but this dress." She plucked at the ragged sleeve as though to prove her words. Cole didn't respond right away. He leaned back in his chair, watching her with eyes that gave little away. "Finally," he said, "you're still standing. That counts for something. The simple acknowledgement caught her off guard. She expected pity, or worse, judgment. Instead, she found herself blinking back tears at his plain-spoken words. The days that followed began to settle into a rhythm. Emma woke early, sometimes before Cole, and insisted on cooking. Her skills were modest, but soon the cabin smelled of warm bread, beans simmering, and occasionally stew when Cole brought in game. She swept the floor, mended old shirts with thread she found tucked in a drawer, and even ventured to the barn to help with chores. At first, Cole said little. He was a man of habit, accustomed to silence and routine. But slowly, he began to notice the difference Emma made. The cabin no longer felt like just a shelter, it began to feel like a home. There was warmth now, not just from the fire, but from her presence. He would find her humming softly as she worked, the sound so delicate it barely reached him, yet it filled the air in ways the wind never could. Still, shadows lingered. Emma woke some nights crying quietly, dreams of betrayal and abandonment haunting her. She thought she hid it well, but Cole would hear her muffled sobs in the dark. He never asked, never pried, but one night he wordlessly draped a blanket over her shoulders as she sat by the fire, trembling. She looked up at him, startled, and found only quiet understanding in his eyes. In turn, Cole fought battles of his own old memories of family lost to fever, of friends buried in shallow graves along the trail. He had walled himself off for years, believing solitude was safer than the pain of loss. Yet Emma's presence stirred something long dormant. He found himself listening for her laugh, watching her as she tried to handle a stubborn chicken or bent over the garden patch with determination. Trust grew slowly, like seedlings pushing through stubborn soil. It wasn't spoken, not directly, but it was felt in the small moments, the way she poured him coffee before he asked, the way he carried heavy buckets so she wouldn't strain herself, the way they began to share the silence without it feeling empty. By the end of the first week, Cole realized something had shifted. Emma wasn't just surviving under his roof. She was becoming part of it. And though he wouldn't admit it aloud, he felt less like a man living alone on the edge of the world, and more like a man with someone worth coming home to. Spring came slow to the frontier. Snow melted in thin streams that cut through the dusty ground, and the prairie grasses began to stir green again. Life on Cole Weston's ranch had settled into a steady rhythm. Days filled with chores, mending fences, tending cattle, planting early seeds, and evenings warmed by the fire where silence was no longer heavy, but companionable. Yet while life on the ranch softened, the outside world had not forgotten them. Gossip spread quickly in small towns, faster than a prairie fire under dry wind. Word had already reached every saloon, shop, and parlor. The abandoned bride who once begged for bread now lived at the lonely Cowboy's ranch. Some said it with pity, others with malice. He took her in like a stray dog, one woman scoffed at the mercantile. No shame, no marriage, just living under his roof. Others whispered with a mix of envy and fascination. Imagine a man like Cole Weston finally letting someone into his life. The talk grew wild, each retelling shaping Emma's story into something at WSN single quotes T. Emma felt the weight of those whispers the first time she rode into town with Cole. They needed supplies, and though she hesitated, Cole had insisted she ride along. As soon as she stepped onto the boardwalk, baskets of goods in her arms, she could feel eyes burning into her. Women whispered behind gloved hands, men exchanged knowing smirks. A group of children even pointed and giggled at the hem of her patched gown. Her cheeks burned, but she straightened her back and walked beside Cole, forcing herself to appear unbothered. Still, she couldn't shake the voices. When they returned to the ranch, her smile faded. She busied herself with chores, but Cole noticed the way her hands trembled as she kneaded dough, the way her shoulders sagged when she thought he wasn't looking. One evening, As the sun bled red across the horizon, Emma finally spoke. "They'll never see me as anything more than what I was," she whispered, staring into the fire. "A foolish girl who trusted the wrong man. Now I'm just some burden you were too kind to turn away." Cole, sitting across from her, leaned forward. His voice was steady low. "You're no burden, Emma. Let 'em talk. They don't live our lives. We do." His words gave her strength, though doubt still gnawed at her. And soon, those doubts were tested. It happened on a Saturday afternoon when they were in town again. The saloon doors swung open, and a man stepped out tall, lean, with a crooked grin and a familiar swagger. Emma froze, the basket slipping from her hands. It was him. Samuel Carter, the man who had married her, stolen her dowry, and abandoned her before the ink on the marriage paper had dried. His hair was slicked back, his coat trimmed finer than before, but his eyes still held that same cold calculation. Well, Samuel drawled, his gaze sliding from Emma to Cole. "Ain't this a surprise? My runaway bride, all dressed up like a rancher's woman." His grin widened, cruel. "You've done well for yourself, sweetheart. Found another fool to take you in." Emma's breath caught, her heart pounding in her chest. The world tilted as memories of betrayal came crashing back. But before she could speak, Cole stepped forward, his frame a wall of iron between her and Samuel. "Leave," Cole said flatly, his voice edged with steel. Samuel chuckled, unbothered. "Now hold on. There's my wife. Ain't that right, Emma? By law, she belongs to me." His words slithered through the street, drawing a small crowd of curious onlookers. Whispers buzzed like angry bees. Emma's throat tightened. The old fear threatened to paralyze her, but then she felt Cole's presence solid, unyielding. She remembered his words by the fire. "We live our lives, not them." Gathering every shred of courage, she stepped out from behind him. "No," she said firmly, her voice trembling but clear. "I don't belong to you. You abandoned me. You left me to starve. You have no claim on me, not as a husband, not as a man." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Samuel's smirk faltered. "You ungrateful." Cole's hand twitched toward his holster, and Samuel's eyes flickered there, reading the warning. For a long, tense moment, the two men stared at each other, the air thick with the promise of violence. Finally, Samuel spat at the dirt and sneered. "This ain't over." He turned on his heel and stalked off, the crowd parting to let him pass. Silence hung heavy after he left, but Emma stood tall, her chin lifted, her body trembling from the effort. Then she felt Cole's hand, gentle but firm, at her elbow. He didn't speak, but his eyes held pride, respect, and something softer she dared not name. The townsfolk, once cruel with their whispers, now saw Emma differently. Not as a beggar in a tattered gown, but as a woman who had faced down her past with courage. That night, back at the ranch, Emma sat by the fire, exhausted but lighter somehow. Cole set a cup of coffee in front of her, his usual quiet gesture. She smiled faintly, meeting his gaze. "Thank you," she whispered, "not just for the coffee, not just for the day, but for standing beside her when the shadows of her past tried to claim her." Cole gave a small nod. For him, words weren't needed. His actions had spoken already. Emma wasn't alone anymore. The prairie dawn rose quietly, painting the horizon in shades of gold and rose. On the small ranch tucked at the edge of the valley, a thin curl of smoke drifted upward from the chimney. Inside, warmth glowed from the fireplace, and the little cabin, once sparse and silent, now held the rhythm of two lives intertwined. The cowboy, Ethan, stirred awake to the faint sounds of movement from the kitchen. For years he had risen to silence, broken only by the wind howling across the plains or the low whinny of horses outside. But now there was the soft clinking of pots, the gentle sound of bread being kneaded, and the faint hum of a woman's voice. His chest tightened in a way he didn't recognize, something between comfort and wonder. He swung his legs over the bed and reached for his boots, pausing as his eyes drifted to the small table near the window. On it sat a vase filled with wildflowers, a touch of brightness he never would have thought to bring indoors. It was her doing, Clara's hand. Everything she touched seemed to soften, to warm, to belong. In the weeks since he had found her begging in town, her presence had changed the very air around him. The ranch no longer felt like a prison of loneliness but a place of hope. Still, questions lingered. Could she ever truly feel at home here? Could a woman cast aside by her own family and betrayed by fate trust a man who had lived so long with walls around his heart? When he stepped into the kitchen, he found her standing by the stove, hair tied loosely back, sleeves rolled up. The aroma of fresh bread filled the room. She looked up, startled, her cheeks flushing pink. "You're awake early," she said softly. Almost shyly, he gave a small, half smile. "Smelled something worth waking for," she laughed lightly, though her eyes carried a tenderness that spoke more than words. For a moment, they stood there, suspended in a quiet understanding. But outside, life still called. The ranch demanded work, the cattle needed tending, fences needed repair. Ethan reached for his hat, preparing to leave, when Clara stopped him. She held out a small piece of bread wrapped in cloth. "For you?" she said simply. He took it, their hands brushing. That fleeting contact sent a warmth through him that lingered even as he rode out into the fields. Throughout the day, he found his thoughts drifting back to her. Each swing of the hammer, each pull of the rope, each whistle to the cattle carried her image in his mind. She had become more than just a woman in need. She was the heartbeat he hadn't realized his life was missing. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the valley in fire, he returned to find her waiting on the porch. She sat with a book in her lap, though it was clear she hadn't been reading. She had been waiting for him. He tied his horse, then walked up slowly, uncertain of his own voice. She stood, hands folded nervously, and looked at him with eyes full of both gratitude and fear. "Ethan," she began, her voice trembling, "I've been thinking. You've given me shelter, food, and kindness when no one else would. But I don't want to just be a burden on you." He stopped her with a shake of his head. "Clara, you ain't a burden. Not a day since you came here have I thought that." Tears welled in her eyes. "Then, what am I to you?" The cowboy, a man who had faced storms, bandits, and years of solitude, suddenly felt his throat tighten. He stepped closer, his hands rough and hesitant as they reached for hers. "You're what I never thought I'd find," he said slowly, each word heavy with truth. "A reason to come home. A reason to keep going. You're home." Her breath caught, and then, with a small sob of relief, she fell into his arms. For the first time, the walls around both their hearts crumbled. The weeks that followed were filled with small joys, building a garden together, mending fences side by side, laughing over burned biscuits or crooked stitches. What had once been a lonely ranch now echoed with shared laughter and quiet prayers whispered at night. The townsfolk who once whispered about the ragged bride begging for bread now saw something different when they visited the market. A woman with light in her eyes, her hand resting in the cowboy's as he carried supplies beside her. They were no longer two broken souls, but one story rewritten by grace, courage, and the unexpected mercy of chance. And so, the lonely cowboy who had once ridden into town for nothing more than supplies had found something he never sought: love, belonging, and the promise of a future no longer haunted by silence. The cabin in the valley stood as a witness, not just to survival, but to a home built from ashes, from bread shared, and from two hearts that had once been hungry for food, for kindness, for love, and now were filled.